Well, this morning it's my privilege to introduce to you a dear friend of mine. I'll just tell you a brief connection. This year happens to be our 50th anniversary as The Journey, aka First Evangelical Free Church, Tucson. And along the journey of this church's history, there are some very wonderful stories and some not so wonderful stories. And so I will abstain from categorizing, but years ago, there was an unintentional church plant out of this church called the Vineyard. And even to this day, there are, apparently I'm told by Kenyon's brother, that's an elder there, that there are chairs that still have our stamp on the bottom of them, First Evangelical Free Church, decades later. And in fact, the original pastor of that congregation, the Vineyard, and pastored there for a number of years, that really knows all the stories about our church, is here with us today. But more than just a 50th anniversary kind of speaker, this is a man of God that God has called to Tucson. He's been here for 44 years. And instead of looking for the next, thing to go on to, God has planted this man of God here to do much more than just lead a local church, although that's awesome. But God has used him in huge ways throughout the cities. And in many ways, and I'm just going to say this, Randy, you have become the pastor's pastor here in Tucson. And Randy Reynolds has been used of God to save my bacon. He has been used of God to bless my heart in seasons of difficulty and adversity. And it's my privilege to introduce you. It was a couple of years ago that you were up here. Pastor Gus brought you here. But it's my privilege as the pastor here to introduce to y'all and make him welcome Randy Reynolds. Come on up, Randy.
Good morning. Well, it's a privilege to be here this morning. I'm thankful for the opportunity. I'm blessed. I'm honored. I'm humbled, and I thank Jim for having me. And so I'm also thankful for Jim. One of the things that's changed since Gus was here is a lot of us older guys have stepped out of the senior pastor role, and we have younger guys, and we're all thanking the Lord that He brings younger people up. So we appreciate Jim and his leadership in this church. Also, just to tell you a funny story, I came and listened to Jim one morning, and I thought, Jim preaches a pretty long time. So I said, Jim, how long am I up for? He goes, 50 minutes. And I thought, 50 minutes is pretty long for me. But I speak all over town, and I speak in the African American church. And usually there they'll say, well, you preach for like an hour and a half, or 2 hours. Well, I preached one time, and I preached for 3 hours, and the pastor goes, you have 2 more to go. And I said, I'm white. So the last time I preached there, I preached for an hour, and I got down, I said, I can't do any more. And he got up and preached for half an hour after me. So then one of my other pastor friends, I said, Jim's let me preach for 50 minutes. And he goes, hey, well, you're always long-winded. Your 35 minutes always go 50 minutes. So he says, plan for 30 minutes. So I'm planning for about that. We'll see how we do. I'm going to start out with a story that some of you may be familiar with. When I was running renewal counseling, I came to work one morning, and my clinical director said, did you see the TV last night? And I said, no, I didn't see it. He said, well, there was a story on there that I think that you ought to attend to. It was a story about a man that was hit on the way to work on his motorcycle by a drunk driver. And he said, what happened was amazing. And I'll just give you a little bit of the background on that. The guy that hit him, his mother attended Calvary Chapel here, and she knew that he was having a hard time with alcohol. So she had been praying that God would deal with him. And what happened was he went to a bar I think it was on a Sunday night. He drank too much. The people at the bar tried to get him not to get in his car. He got in his car anyway. And he drove down the street, but he was so drunk that he knew that he shouldn't be driving. So he pulled off, fell asleep, woke up, but he was still extremely intoxicated, went on and he hit this man named Ron Babbage on his motorcycle. And Ron was pronounced dead at the scene. And he had every bone in the bottom of his body broken from his pelvis down. He also had his larynx crushed. So they went to Thomas, the guy that hit him, and they said, the guy that you hit is dead. And he said, what does that mean? And he said, well, it's probably a mandatory sentence of at least 25 years in prison. He was 28 years old. So he was devastated. His mom shows up and she's crying and she said, God, I wanted you to deal with my son, but I didn't want him to go to prison. Lord, be merciful. An EMT walked over, pulled the sheet off Ron, and found out that he wasn't dead. They just didn't see any vitals at first. And because his larynx was crushed, they couldn't feel any breath. So they trached him there. And as the story goes on, about a month later, Thomas goes to court, and it's a mandatory sentence, and the judge is saying, well, he's not dead, but we want you to go to prison for 9 years. Ron stands up and he says, I don't want him to go to prison. I don't want him to go to prison. He says, why don't you want him to go to prison? He said, I don't want him to go to prison because I went to prison at 19 for drunk and disorderly. And he said, I spent 15 years in and out of prison. And he says, my friends will kill him if he goes to prison. He said, what I want him to do is rehab me. I want him to work with me so I can learn to walk again. So they put him in a work release program where he worked during the day and spent the night in jail for a year. So my clinical director says, you got to meet these people. So I called them up. We did an hour-and-a-half interview on tape. And I found that they were all people of faith. Everybody in both families had faith. That surprise you? They all had faith. And told amazing stories. Now, one of the things that I've gotten into in my community development is a thing called restorative justice. When a criminal creates a crime, they owe a debt. Who do they owe the debt to? I'm a therapist, so you have to talk to me. Say it loud. Who do they owe the debt to? God. Well, that's what we would say in church. Would be God. Yeah. The victim. The victim. One of the main things we do in restorative justice is when you commit a crime against another person, you owe the other person the debt. And what we've done in our community in the last 1,000 years is we've made the debt focused on who? On the state. What that does is it eliminates relationship. And so you can think about this. Who would have the strongest feelings in this situation? Would it be the state or would it be Ron Babbage? It'd be Ron. And how would he feel? If somebody broke every bone in the bottom part of your body, how would you feel? You'd be pretty angry. And so the debt needed really to be paid to Ron. And doing the interviews, Thomas was overwhelmed with grief. Why? Why was he overwhelmed? He knew that he should have gone to prison for what he did, but he was forgiven. And all he had to do was meet with Ron and help him learn to walk again. In our community, there's some amazing people that are working on restorative justice. And out of this, I've been able to become a spokesman in a variety of ways, but I see this as a much bigger process than restorative justice. I see it as restorative processes. Linda, would you stand up? I'm not sure who's all here, but Linda Leatherman is our liaison in the community between the government and the faith community, and she's been a big part of doing the restorative justice. And Bill Bontrager, is Bill in here? Bill has played a part. He's your very own, but he's played a major part in restorative justice. And there are other people, I don't know that anybody made it here, Mike Burns, Judge Wilson, Jim Fish, Rick Stevenson. There's a variety of people that are working to bring about the kingdom of God and the concepts of restorative justice in our legal system. One of the things we look for in community development is that every domain, every system has some of the elements of the kingdom of God in it. And there's a lot of great people working in this direction.